I think one of the hardest things to do is talk about one's self. For me, anyway. I know plenty of people who don't have a problem waxing on about stories about their life. And when I am in a certain mood, I have the ability to tell a few stories here and there. But I often think that it's in my head, it sounds good. But when it comes out, it may not be the most intriguing story. Now, I like to interview people because then I get to hear their stories. And that's a whole lot more important to me than what I've done. But there is one story that I've been wanting to tell for many, many years now. And it started back when I was in high school and I had a salvation experience with the help of some friends of mine that are still friends of mine today. We go way back. Gail Ganser, now Gail Gardner, and her family, the Ganser family, Dr. Ganser and Mrs. Ganser. But because of that experience, I started seeking out more information about the church and about how the church worked. Growing up Roman Catholic, switching to Protestantism, which, because as a Roman Catholic, I felt something was lacking a little bit. Back in seventh or eighth grade, we had a retreat to a place called Picture Rocks in Tucson, Arizona. And while we were there, we had a lot of time to just sit and read and think and meditate. And I took my Good News for Modern Man, and I was reading it, and I skipped past Romans and Acts and all that, and I went to First John, and I started reading, and it talked about, when you want to go to God, you have an intercessor, which is Jesus Christ. And automatically, as this is before I switched to Protestantism, still Roman Catholic, and all of a sudden in my head snapped, and I'm like, wait a minute. I have a direct connection. I don't have to go through a priest or a saint or anything like that. Kathleen Madigan, the comedian, talks about her Roman Catholicism experience and how, her parents told her, hey, you don't bother Jesus with that stuff. That's why you got all these saints and all these other people here to go through. And you get this laundry list of people who you can talk to instead because you don't want to bother Jesus. Well, I took the other look at that and said, wait a minute. If I can go directly, what is all this that I'm doing here? So it got me thinking at that point, and I know I'm not supposed to touch my face, but I did. It got me thinking at that point that maybe there was something else out there. And I had this really, I knew my first communion, first confession was coming up. And I was like, nah, I don't really want to go to a priest and go sit in a dark room there and tell all my sins. And at that time, the church was transitioning into a more of a therapy-based session kind of confession, where we were going to go into an open, airy room with lights on. The priest was going to sit across from us, and we were going to tell him all the thoughts in our head, the things that that were sins to us. And it's a way of kind of getting you used to that control of, you have to go somewhere else and you have to get absolved from your evil deeds or your sins, however you want to look at them. Well, anyway, so flash forward to high school. And when I had this conversion experience, I sought out a church that, I thought might, that's not really a true story. Let me go back a little bit. I was dating this young lady, and she and I were both in high school, and she was a couple of years younger than I was. But I kind of like fell in love. I had this first crush experience. She was the first girl that I ever like really connected with and really wanted to spend time with. And she was in the Protestant church. So I'm already thinking here, this could go this way. And so around that same time, the conversion experience happened. So I started to think about going to a different church other than the Catholic Church. Well, the church that her stepfather was a pastor of was a little bit too energetic. I'll just put it that way for me. A little bit too much energy, a little bit too much speaking in tongues, things that I totally didn't understand or didn't get. So I decided to go to a friend of hers church, Colleen Waddell, was her best friend. And I went to her church, who her dad was a pastor of. And boy, I got sucked in immediately. This guy was so charismatic. Al Waddell was his name, the Reverend Al Waddell. And I tell you, every time he spoke, you were just sitting on the edge of your seat. He would tell a story in a way that would just bring it to life and just suck you in there. And because of that, I became totally involved in the church there. And as I was there, I started learning about some of the things that he was doing, which was more political than religious in nature. He was also a federal firearms dealer, which I thought was pretty interesting. But he had this own little shop where he made silencers. Well, he didn't make silencers. He made the internal parts for a silencer. So the little packs, and they were in 22, 45, and 9 millimeter. And so he said, well, I'll pay you to come work for me. And at this point, I'm 16, not quite 17 years old. And I'm in there cutting brass screen in these round circles and putting them on these dowels and pressing them together with the neoprene discs in between and figuring out how to make silencers. And I'm like totally amazed. I mean, this is like so cool to me. Didn't dawn on me that we might be doing something we weren't supposed to be doing. And he didn't, his take on it was, well, as long as you don't put the external sheath over it and sell the parts, you were legal, because you could sell the internal components, but you couldn't sell the two together. And whoever sold the tubes that went over it had to get them licensed, or had to have them through the federal firearms dealership, or how the federal firearms Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had to have them registered. And I thought that was very interesting. But at the same time, we were making auto sears for AR-15s to make them into M16s. But of course, you needed a bolt carrier, you needed a trigger mechanism, and all that stuff in order to be able to do that. But that was sort of my introduction into this. But at the same time, going to church and going to Sunday school and learning about God and learning about the Bible and stuff like that. And through this time, I started thinking about what my role was, in this church, what my role was in my future. I had already missed out going into the Air Force because I'd had an accident in high school where I hit a kid with my car. They were suing. I was ready to I went to Phoenix to AAFES, went through all the process of getting sworn in. And at the very end, right before you raised your right hand and, swore in, they put you in a little room and they said, is there anything that you know of that could keep you from getting in to the armed forces? Well, and at the time I was like, well, I knew about this court case that was against me, because I hit this kid with my car. Totally other story there. If you ever want to know, we'll talk about that some other time. But I said, well, there is this pending court case. And they're like, whoa, stop right there. Until you get the court case figured out, we can't let you in. Excuse me, I got a cold. So I said, oh, well, that kind of sucked, because I was, looking forward to doing this. I had my job all set up. I had scored the 97th percentile in the ASVAB test, and I was like, I could have had any job I wanted. And I said, okay. So when I went back to the church, I started thinking, well, what am I going to do now? This is May. I'm not going to go in the Air Force, obviously. I said, okay. So I continued to work at the church, making the silencer parts and doing some other things for the preacher, making the end caps and that, and the threaded caps for the barrels, and got involved in that. We would go out shooting in the desert and, firing weapons and stuff like that, and get a BAR and fire tracer rounds into the desert. And that was all pretty cool. But as I was doing this, I'm like, it's not really all for me. So I got a job on the Navajo Indian Reservation, working for their police department there. I worked for Navajo Community College, but also it was a double thing. They would train you to be a police officer while you were working for this. And so I did that, and I did it from September through about December. And in that time period, I was like, it's pretty cold up here. The snow was pretty thick, and I kind of got in trouble doing burnouts in the patrol blazer, and I was like, well, maybe I want to do something different. They even gave me the guard dog, the Doberman Pinscher that was trained to attack and seek out people in dark spaces like that. It was a very, very good dog. But anyway, so I said, nah, I'm not going to do that again. So I went back to Tucson, went back to the church. And at that time, things had started heating up between the Reverend and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. What happened is that Al Waddell decided to get another member in the church, Bill Shaw, to order the 2-inch tubes in stock lengths. And then they were going to cut them down and make them, because the government had kind of put a crackdown on those people making the tubes. So he says, well, we're just going to go around that. Well, of course, he'd been being monitored for some time now. In fact, he even used to joke. He'd pick up the phone. He'd go, I know you're listening, and hang it up. And so they decided they were going to order the tubes. But before we get to that, I got to go back a little bit. Another guy in my church, my age, Mark Cymbalak, he and I were there hanging around the church. And one day the preacher comes to us and he goes, I need you guys to come with me. I need you to be witnesses in case something weird happens. And we're like, okay, didn't know that it would be dangerous or think that it would be dangerous. He didn't tell us it might be dangerous. So we got in his Mark IV Cadillac, on Mark IV Lincoln, drove down to a deserted gas station at the end of Prince Road there, and we sat there for a little while. And all of a sudden, this black vehicle, solid black SUV, pulled up, Suburban, and 2 men got out in suits and ties. And I'm like, this is kind of weird that they'd be getting out in suits and ties. But anyway, so, we're kind of sitting there, and he asks us to get out of the vehicle so that these guys can see there's more than himself there. And they went up to Al Waddell, and they shook his hand, and they said, can we see? Al opened up the trunk of his Lincoln, which was a pretty big trunk, and it had a big, it's not a case, but it was like something you see at the end of your bed, one of those trundles there that opens up, and it looks like a booty case from the Pirates or something like that. Well, anyway, open that up, and it's filled with handguns. I mean, at least hundreds, maybe even 1,000, because it was about 2 feet tall, about 4 feet, and about 2 feet deep. So it was pretty large. Anyway, so he opened the case. They looked at him, took out a couple, kind of worked the mechanisms, in there, and saw that. Then they closed it, lifted it out, put it in the back of the Suburban, came back and handed the preacher, Al Waddell, an envelope. And then they went on their merry way, and so did we. Now, thinking back to that time now, actually, it didn't take that long. It was probably in the 80s and 90s when I figured this out. But this was right about the time of the Iran-Contra affair, where we were sending weapons down to Nicaragua to help the Contras fight. And it dawned on me somewhere after that this is what these weapons were going down there to do. This is what the intention was. Because they obviously didn't need a full caseload of handguns unless there was a reason for it. Now, I know this sounds far-fetched, but this is absolutely true. This was one of those stories one of many stories that kind of made me, think, what's the heck's going on here? So anyway, back to the other story. So it started heating up between the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, the Pima County Sheriff's, Tucson Police Department, and the FBI. Now, I don't think they had any idea that he had been supplying guns to men in suits, which to me would probably have been the CIA. I know it sounds far-fetched. It does. But anyway, so one day after they ordered the tubes, men came up to the house. Not a couple men. I'd probably say a dozen men. Some of them had their faces covered. Some of them didn't. And they came into the house and had a search warrant and started rumbling through and started going through everything that was in there. Now, the preacher had a gun safe. He had an AR-15 in there, not fully automatic, just an AR-15. He had a MAC-10 and a MAC-11, which are open bolt firing guns, which could be machine guns if you wanted to manufacture them that way. They found 6 or 7 fake IDs, Arizona driver's license. I mean, legitimate Arizona driver's license in his desk. I don't think he ever thought they were coming there. But they started collecting stuff. They took all the auto sears that he had made for the M16s and said, well, these are illegal, because they were newly manufactured. And there was a law that went into effect. I think if you could have them if they were made before, and I don't know the date. I'd be lying if I said for sure. But it's like something like if they were made before 1974, then they were legal. If they were made after that, they were illegal. And of course, there's no dates on any of these things, so there's no way of proving it. So they went through this and they collected all this stuff. They went into his gun safe. They found the AR-15. They found the auto sears, and they said, oh, here's the intent to make a fully automatic machine gun. Then they took the MAC-10s and they're playing with them, and then he took the MAC-11. He's playing with it and he's looking at it, and he's like, well, this isn't fully automatic, so he lays it down. Unbeknownst to them, they were both fully automatic. The preacher, being a federal firearms dealer and a pretty smart guy, he had developed a way that you put a tiny screwdriver in the stock of the gun, by the trigger mechanism. You go up there and there was a little set screw, and you turn the set screw a quarter turn clockwise, and then it fired from an open bolt. You turn it back the other way, it fired from a closed bolt. So the ATF had 2 fully automatic weapons in their hand, and they put them back in the case because they didn't think so. So they didn't arrest him that day, but they took all his stuff. He had a box that was probably 10 by 8 by 4 that was filled with Krugerrands, which are, 1 ounce gold pieces. And as he sold his silencer inserts on the web, or not on the web, but in the Shotgun News, or he'd go to a gun show and sell them, he would turn that money into gold and put it in there. So he had all that. Well, all of a sudden now there's this big thing where he becomes this, what's the word I want? Radical constitutionalist, which I had not really seen before. And so he brings these films in, and he brings these short circuit TV things in where he's bringing these people in that are talking about the Constitution, how wrong the government is for doing this, and how we need to fight against them about doing this. And he's like totally getting the church like in this frothy, kind of rabid kind of sense of we need to do something. And at this point, I'm like, I'm kind of wondering, I'm kind of on board a little bit, but I'm kind of wondering, is this the right thing for a 16, 17-year-old to be participating in? But his daughter was my girlfriend's best friend, and I wanted to maintain that relationship because my girlfriend had gone away at the time, and that's a whole nother story for another time. But anyway, so I was kind of there. And we watched all that kind of unfold and how this was happening and how all of a sudden now he's got a court date and he's got to go to court, and he's wanting to pay the court with promissory notes because he says the dollar's not backed by a gold or silver standard, so it's not valid, it's not valuable. So he would write a promissory note. He said that's all the dollar is. So he kept getting in trouble for that. And then it came time to where they were going to talk about the illegally, coercing with another member of the church to put together silencers. He went all through that. He got convicted of that, and he was out on parole, not on parole, but he was out on bail. And it was the day of his sentencing. And by this time I was back at Bob Jones, so I missed all that part of it. But I heard about it. Oh, by the way, he was a Bob Jones University graduate, and I think they kind of disowned him after all this stuff. But anyway, so I went back to Bob Jones, and during his court date, came time for his sentencing hearing, and he disappears. He just totally disappears, and he goes on the run. And there's a whole lot more to this story, but he goes on the run for about 5 or 6 years. Then one day he is hiding in the back seat of a car, driving through Canada, which he's also a Canadian citizen. He's got dual citizenship, born in Canada and then lived in the U.S. Police pull over this vehicle for speeding or some kind of violation, that find him in the back, incarcerate him, put him in there, and then, of course, there's this big deal of getting him extradited back to the U.S. Back up a little bit. While he's missing, the show America's Most Wanted does a whole show, well, about a 15-minute part of the show, on the Reverend Al Waddell and all his different aliases and all his different radical things. And they show him blowing up milk jugs in the desert, which never happened to my knowledge. I mean, I've been to the desert shooting guns with him full times, but they're showing fully automatic weapons firing in the dirt. And he was very conscientious about not firing fully automatic weapons in the desert because you never know who was watching. But anyway, so he is on America's Most Wanted. He is like on every person's watch list around there to try to find him because they think he's this like dangerous criminal, which I guess philosophically he was dangerous, but not physically. You know, he wasn't a violent kind of person, even though he loved guns, but he wasn't a violent person. And so they finally find him. He gets incarcerated. He spends a few years in a Canadian jail. They finally extradite him to the U.S. He goes before the same judge, Judge Bilby, that he was going to be sentenced by. And for some reason, Judge Bilby goes, I give you time served. You know, you're off on your own. And that was the last I heard about Al Waddell. He had gone on. I guess he had quieted down, gone to other things. And I recently found out that he moved to Montana. He had remarried. And I looked him up, found where he was living in Montana, but then found that he had died in 2023. And all this to say, this guy had a Hollywood story. This film would have been amazing to shoot because there's so much more to go into. I mean, we had a guy in our church named Kelly who was a convicted felon, and he would have black powder guns because according to the way the law was written, a black powder isn't the same as a handgun because it doesn't have a shell. It's, you know, you pack it and you put the thing in it. So they were trying to get around that. And so much all went on with this. But luckily, when I went to Bob Jones, I kind of got away from all that. And I kind of started hearing a different side of Christianity and all that. And even so, when it came down to it, it was like, you know, I don't know that I'm ready for this, you know. But anyway, so that's kind of the story of the short story of Al Waddell, and quite a fascinating person. He was a professor at Hiles Anderson College after he graduated from Bob Jones. He taught there. There's some great stories I can tell you about that. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story there. He had told us that he had this loudmouth student in the front seat that was always arguing with him, always kind of checking him on anything he would say, even if he was wrong or right. The kid wouldn't shut up. And he had a German Luger that he had as he was collecting guns, and he put a low load in it and a big ball of cotton in it, so it was a blank. And one day he pulls it out of his desk and he shoots the kid in the chest with this blank, and the kid just kind of froze, didn't know what to do, thought he was shot. That was the kind of thing he was. That was the kind of person he was. He wanted to teach a lesson there. And I just got through saying he wasn't violent. Well, it was a blank. If he was violent, I guess it would have had a real bullet in it. And I don't know if he got fired for that or reprimanded. I tend to think he still worked there after that. But so that was one of the things. And, we did go out in the desert. We did go shooting. We did work on a bunch of different firearms. One time we had bikers come onto the property. He managed, as the preacher, he was also the manager of an apartment complex that had 8 units. So it had 5 down one side and 3 up the other. So that was the 8. And several members of the church were in there. I was living in there for a while. And so about 6 of the 8 units were church members. One day, 2 motorcyclists came riding through, and they were bikers. They were gang members, one of the local gangs in Tucson. And Al Waddell went up and saw them as they came around the back the second time. He kind of got in front of them, and they stopped. And he goes, "I need you guys to get out of here." He said, "Oh, we're not going anywhere. We're looking for somebody." And he goes, "Well, they don't live here, So like, "Oh, yeah, screw you, So they take off. Well, a little while later, he hears them coming back again. So they go back around the side of the dirt driveway, and then back around the bottom of the apartments. They come back up. And as he does, the preacher goes inside and he gets his BAR, Browning automatic rifle, and he stands in front of the guy, in front of the 2 motorcycles. And the guys are looking at him. They go, "What are you going to do?" And he fires off 3 rounds into the ground really quick. And these guys are like, "You're freaking crazy, man." They used another word other than that. And so they took off and they never came back. However, the police came because they heard about the shots. And, Al Waddell denied that he shot it. And nobody could prove it. Nobody actually saw it. Couldn't find any evidence or trace evidence that they did it. So, but I think that might have been the thing that started getting him on the radar if his phone wasn't tapped already. But anyway, I had hoped at one point to catch up with Al Waddell before he passed away, to find out what those last years after he got out, after he was released from his sentencing here not here, but in Tucson, to see what happened over the next several years. Because there were so many stories that I did not get from him that I would love to share. But anyway, that's pretty much it. That's all I wanted to share with you guys today. And I'm not that radical kid. In fact, I wasn't a radical kid then. I was just very impressionable. But it's still fun to kind of think about it and think about those times. There are lots of stories from back in those days.